In Asia, a lot of founders are still much more conservative. I guess that this is kind of like the word of the day is because conservative. A baby who doesn't cry doesn't eat. Right. Meaning that you have to go out there and tell people what you're doing, what you're looking for, and what you're looking to achieve. And I think I met a lot of founders in Taiwan and Japan who are super, super talented, but it's missing a little bit of that. Not being shy about what you're doing. I think as a founder, you're going all in on your company. It's like raising a child. So you should be proud of your child.
Okay, so Eric, so we have kind of like a mutual connection, right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
We have multiple connections.
You born and raised in New York,
Yes.
Brooklyn, and I used to live in New York and now San Francisco. And you used to live in Bay Area in 13 years. Yeah.
So I'm born and raised in New York City. At the time when I was going to school there and working there, I would say the tech community wasn't as big as it is now, right? New York City is so big now with startups, but it wasn't the case at the time. So we all had this Silicon Valley dream. So I quit my comfortable job in New York City.
What was the first job?
I actually worked in an advertising agency. So it was a big company, a great company actually. And it was a very comfortable position. But I knew I wanted to do something bigger. And I knew I wanted to build. Right, I've always been a builder, and I'd love to do it. So I packed my car, just a blanket, a pillow, and just some clothes, a couple of outfits, and I just drove across the U.S. to move to Silicon Valley, and then stayed there for about 13, 14 years. And I worked at big tech, so I worked at companies like Oracle, at Dell. Then I also founded my own company as well too. Previously I was a co-founder of a YC startup called Basilica. And then after that, I worked in venture capital for a little bit, where I was a venture partner for an accelerator program called Larry's Labs. They're actually based out of New York. And now I'm building Colega AI. So I think my career has been this, but I've been lucky enough to experience big tech, startups, venture capital, and I think that's been really beneficial for me building my current company because I got experiences from both sides of the table, right? And it helps drive this company forward.
I see. So did you like living in Bay Area?
Yeah, I think Bay Area is really great. Definitely the innovation hub of the world. The world's best ideas and companies come from there, at least technology companies and startups. And it's a great environment, but it's extremely competitive as well. Everyone is building something. There's a joke that you don't even ask people what they do for a living or a career in Silicon Valley because they're all in tech. Yeah. Or they're all founders. Right?
Yes.
So it's like founder A, founder B, founder C. Everyone is a founder, and it's a great environment for someone who is really looking to challenge themselves and to build something special.
I see. So why did you decide to leave from Bay Area?
I think that's a really good question. I think I've learned a lot from the Bay Area. I'm a forever student. I'm learning every single day.
I love this word.
Yeah.
Forever student.
Forever student. You know, you got to be a sponge. Everywhere you go, keep learning. Otherwise, you're stuck in the stubborn bubble, and things change while you stay the same, right? So I'm a forever student for sure. But I think I've obtained all the tools and lessons and knowledge that I needed in Silicon Valley to not have to be there physically, right? To be able to capitalize on other amazing markets, markets that are starting to, grow, right? And that's what I hope to do now in Japan. Hopefully, I can take my knowledge and my experience in Silicon Valley and not shove it down Japan or force it into Japan, but at least find how I can have a hybrid of my experience to succeed in the local market here.
Eric, so you are staying in this Tokyo from before Christmas, like almost or 1 month, right? This is your first time to like long staying, right?
Yeah, first time.
Yeah, so tell us about your observation, startup scene in Tokyo, and also Japanese culture.
Yeah, I think first off, I'm thoroughly surprised about how much is going on in the tech ecosystem. I think everywhere I go, there's events, there's AI events, there's startup events everywhere and all over Tokyo. And I meet so many people who are also building, and they also invite me to these events. So I'm really surprised and really happy that there's so much happening in Tokyo right now. I would say that people have been extremely friendly to me, really open-minded, and just been very open to teach me about Japan, and to tell me about how the ecosystem works. And aside from that, I think there's obviously been struggles as well. So there's no like everything's rainbows, right? And I always try to be honest with people on LinkedIn or anywhere else that, hey, there's not always like rainbows for building a company. There's always struggles. Most of the time it's struggles. I would say for every one good thing that happens to you, 100 bad things happen to you, right?
It's real.
It's real. It's very real. And I think one of the at least struggles that I faced in Japan is experiencing cultural conservatism. I think that is very real, and it does exist in Japan. Probably, I assume less so in Tokyo compared to other places, but it was something. And as someone who is not from the country, I always try to move into a new country with open mind. I try not to be biased. I don't think about stereotypes, so everything is a clean slate, right? But yeah, I think the culture here is still very conservative, and that affects a lot of startup founders like myself. In particularly hiring. Hiring has been a bit of a challenge in Japan. I think hiring in general is a challenge because you want to find the right people, not only in skills but also
So this
fit your
is
culture.
your hiring manager's perspective. Really?
So I think definitely a hiring manager's perspective. Number one, if you want to join a startup, right, you have to have a personality that is a risk taker, right?
Risk taker.
A risk taker.
I see.
You have to be a risk taker, right? You have to be willing to get excited to start from zero, and then be resilient and be okay with going from 0 to 1 and then back to 0 again, right? Because a startup is constantly changing. Constantly changing. One day you're building one thing, but then you realize that there's no product market fit, and you got to throw it away and then redo it. But you got to do it fast, right? And I think that takes a very special personality, very special candidate, and that candidate is very rare anywhere, not just in Japan. I want to state that, all right? I think finding the perfect startup employee is a difficult job anywhere you are, but I will say that it has been slightly more difficult in Japan. Because I think there is a culture of failure is bad, right?
You knew it.
Yeah, failure is bad. Putting yourself in a position of potential failure is bad. And then just working for a company that is not established yet in Japan, not well known, not stable, is also not something that's too attractive to many candidates in Japan. But I do see a cultural shift, especially in the younger generations. I think the younger generations are more open to taking risk, are more excited about making an impact. So they're choosing impact over stability, right? And I think that's the lesson here. Like the best startup employee is like impact over stability.
Speaking of conservative in Japan, so most Japanese people, especially non-English speakers, they don't use LinkedIn
Yes, that's true.
because LinkedIn have to show our face, real name, real work history, right? Japanese people, many people concerned to show all data. That's why they love to use X Twitter, because of we can be a anonymous. It's of course pros and cons, right?
Yeah. I think it's funny because I'm glad you brought that insight to me, because as an American, it's quite common to be on LinkedIn, and it's quite common to show your face, right? And for people to know your background. And so that is a cultural difference there as well too. And I think one of the biggest cultural differences that I've experienced in Japan is in the US, in Silicon Valley specifically, failure is a natural thing towards progress, right? In Silicon Valley, we don't see failure as a bad thing. In fact, we wear it like a badge, right? It's almost like, how many times have you failed? And that's like a good thing, right? Like, oh, I have 4 failed startups. Cool, right? That means you got 4 different perspectives of lessons and wisdom, right? So I think that is something that is a big difference, and not just in Japan. I think in Asia, especially, even in Taiwan, we see that as well too, where no one wants to put themselves in a position of potential failure, right? And this is no disrespect to Taiwan or Japan. I think it's just cultural differences, and it depends on what you want to do in your career. If you're in startups, then you gotta maybe adjust a little bit. But if you're working for a corporate, then that's probably not something you should really be concerned about.
I see. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's like so kind of culture gap between US and also Japan and Taiwan.
It's a balance, right? It's a balance, right? Because, I am a foreigner, right? I'm not from Japan. And of course, we have no right to come into a country and try to change the culture, right? You have to respect the culture for what it is. But then we also have to run our own company as well too, right? So it's a delicate balance where, we have to respect the local culture and the way of doing things, but then also have a hybrid model where internally as a company, we can still remain true to ourselves and follow my vision as a founder.
Yeah. I like it, your attitude and behavior, like respect to the local culture and then like finding a good balance. This is a good way to start business in this local. I love that.
And I think it's actually, in a business sense, more beneficial for Colega to be more respectful of the local culture, because we're not targeting enterprises, right? We're not targeting companies that, have global offices, that, speak English or have a Western way of doing things. We're targeting the local, true Japanese small business owner, right? And we want to make sure that our team is walking in their shoes, that we understand them, and that whenever we talk to them, they feel like, there's a bond there. There's a trust, right? And you don't build trust by trying to shove your own culture into an existing one, right? You just don't do that. And so I think for us specifically, it's also very important to respect the local culture and to adapt to it.
Thank you so much. Okay, so how about, did you talk with local entrepreneurs in Tokyo and Taipei? Did you find something cultural difference, or I don't know, like a personality difference, or almost the same?
That's a really good question. I think founders by default, we share a very similar DNA, right? And that DNA is our love and passion for building, right? About changing things that currently is running one way into a better way. At least we think it's a better way, right? Maybe it's not, right? So I think we share that building and that need for change DNA. But I would say the differences is probably about the way that we do things. In Asia, a lot of founders are still much more conservative. I guess that this is kind of like the word of the day is conservative. They don't want to be too aggressive with getting what they want, right? I believe in a phrase that a baby who doesn't cry doesn't eat, right?
Baby doesn't
Cry.
cry.
Doesn't eat.
Doesn't it? Okay.
Right? Meaning that you have to go out there and tell people what you're doing, what you're looking for, and what you're looking to achieve. And I think I met a lot of founders in Taiwan and Japan who are super, super talented, but it's missing a little bit of that. And you don't want too much of that, but you definitely want a little bit of that. So I think it's being more of a go-getter, not being shy about what you're doing. I think as a founder, you're going all in on your company. It's like raising a child. So you should be proud of your child, right? You should be out there telling people about your company, telling people about the problem you're solving and what you're trying to change. I think that's so important. I think that's kind of the biggest thing. But of course, there's like the other side of things, right? People will say Americans are very shameless, right? That we can come off as very arrogant as well. That, hey, don't they have any shame? How can they be running around just pitching to everyone? So that is the cultural difference there. But again, it's how do we strike a good balance?
I see. So speaking of founders, so can I talk about my story?
Yes, please. I would love.
I used to, previous company was Japanese startup. Already it was middle size, like over 200 people. And then in pandemic time, they launched and then succeeded because of a metaverse, like a virtual office. Anyway, they failed because of no more pandemic in Japan. So almost all employees have to go to office. So they stopped to use our product. And not only product market fit. So now I can understand. The top people, they tend to not focus on like a specific. So many function, adding. That's why we lost like a core function. Core function was thanks to a virtual office. We could talk with other people using this screen, but it was not stable. Like always, like freezing or voice is not good. But top people decision, they could focus on this fixing, but they focus on like adding new function. That's why it was the reason. So what do you think as our serial entrepreneurs? So prioritize for function is so important.
Yeah, I think for founders, one of the biggest curse that we go through is that we have too many ideas. So it's very easy for a founder to say, hey, I'm going to work on this project. And then, I have a really cool idea. Let me work on that project as well too. And then this project, right? So you're doing 3 different companies at one time, but then none of them are really going to succeed because you're not putting 100% effort into any of them, right? And I don't believe anything succeeds unless you put 100% effort, right? And that not only applies to building a startup, but also as scaling a startup as well too, right? And this is the question of the journey of product market fit. Right? Product market fit is not a one-time thing, right? You don't just find it and then, all right, let's just keep repeating the same thing over and over again, right? Product market fit for the first 5 customers and the first 10 customers is different than your 100 customers. And then product market fit is different for 1,000 customers. Everything's constantly changing, right? And then if you're a startup that is being very stubborn, who just does things one way, or you do things too many ways in your case, it can be really, really hurtful. So I think at the end of the day, it's about focusing on the customer. Nothing more important than a customer. You don't figure out what to build. Your customer figures out what you should build, right? You just find innovative ways to go about doing that. Right. And so your situation at your company is a very common one. It's a very common one. I hear that about a lot of big companies. You hear them get huge funding. They have like big VCs and big office, but then a couple years later they end up,
You are right.
Yeah, folding, right? Yeah. It's unfortunate, but it's something that we have to remind ourselves every single day. Focus. Customer first.
Thank you. Okay, so Eric, last question. Tell us about your milestone in 2025.
Yeah, 2025, I think the Japanese market is such a key market for Colega AI. So we launched in Taiwan as more of a POC market because we had,
POC.
yes, POC market, proof of concept market, because we had a lot of connections there, and then we had a big network there. So it was a good way for us to immediately validate our solution, to see if it works, to tweak it, to optimize it. But we know that you can't just focus on the Taiwanese market. It's a great market, but it's still a very small market. So our biggest goal for 2025 is definitely Japan. We want to make sure that we're signing up users. We want to make sure that we're hiring a good team here as well too. Our major milestone is I'm going to sign up 1,000. I'm trying to sign up 1,000 restaurants this year. How about that? Most importantly, we want to do it in a way where we're respectful of the business owner. We're always solving their problem, and we always put their needs before ours first. And we want to do things the right way.
I see. How about your personal milestone? What to-do list or wish list?
My wish list is probably to learn some Japanese. So I want to maybe start taking some classes or trying some apps. And then also just helping more people. I think that's probably my wish list and my goal every single year is to help as many people as possible, especially founders. Because I think there is this misconception that being a founder is sexy, it's super fun all the time. Everyone is going to be Mark Zuckerberg, right? Everyone is going to be Elon Musk. I don't know, right? But reality is being a founder is extremely difficult. It's a very tough path to go down, and I try to be as honest as possible about the challenges that you're going to face. And more often than not, you're going to face challenges than celebrating wins, right? And this could be helping existing founders, encouraging new founders, or encouraging new founders not to be founders, right? I think that's also a very helpful thing to do as well too, because not everyone is made to be a founder, and that's completely okay, right? So I think helping people is definitely another personal milestone and goal of mine for 2025.
I love that. Actually, I have similar passion. That's why I do this podcast to interview founders.
It's been great. And I think your podcast has kind of shed a more honest light on startups. And then you have a very diverse group of guests as well too that can express their opinions and knowledge from different perspectives. And I feel so bad, but I forgot the lady's name from your last podcast. She Yuko, yes. She was fantastic. Hi, Yuko. You were fantastic. Your insights were great, and her insights were about scaling into the US and then going back and forth. I think that's also such an important topic, and so you're doing great work. Really, this is awesome.
Yeah. I see. Yeah, so not only podcast, I love to collaborate with other founders and also investors, accelerator. We can do collaborate and then making just like a 2 hours event. This is good for like making a connection, like to show our pain point. Hiring is hard, or finding co-founder is hard, finding US investors like that. So that's why I want to make just a tiny every month event. I want to do it. I want to do it with you.
Yes, yeah, let's do it. And then I noticed that you have a couple events coming up as well too, all around Tokyo. I think they're going to be great events. So if you're a founder or investor looking to find some more insights, definitely try to attend her events.
Yeah. And also, if you want to reach out to Eric, please check his LinkedIn and send a message, right?
Yes. Yep, you can find me on LinkedIn. I talk a lot on LinkedIn, probably a little bit too much sometimes, but I'm always responsive, so feel free to drop me a DM if you have questions, or if you're a potential customer or an investor. I'm always open up for a conversation.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, so, jayo!
Yes.
Jayo and fighting!
Yes.
頑張りましょう!
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Eric, part 2. 1. Avoiding common startup mistakes, focusing on core functions. A major reason startups fail is losing focus on their core value proposition. I share my experience from a former startup that added too many features, diluting the product key function and causing customer dissatisfaction. Eric Insight startup must focus relentlessly on solving the customer's core problems. He emphasized, you don't figure out what to build. Your customer does. His approach with Colega AI ensures the product remains simple and effective for small business owners. 2. Cultural insight, adapting to Japan's startup ecosystem. Transitioning from Silicon Valley to Japan, Eric emphasizes the importance of respecting local culture while balancing it with a founder's vision. He notes Japan's conservatism can pose challenges, especially in hiring for startups. Example, Eric has observed that younger Japanese professionals shifting toward prioritizing impact over stability, signaling a positive culture shift for startups. 3. Cultural insight, balancing respect and innovation in Japan. Eric highlights the unique cultural dynamics of Japan's startup ecosystem, especially its conservatism and risk aversion. These cultural traits open impact hiring, decision-making, and pace of innovation in startups. Specific example, unlike Silicon Valley, where failures seen as a badge of honor, Japan has a deeply ingrained cultural fear of failure. This mindset makes it harder for startups to attract talent, as many prefer stable, well-known companies over the risks of a new venture. Eric shares how this has made hiring in Japan more challenges, especially for roles requiring risk takers who can thrive in a fast-changing startup environment. Adapting to local culture, Eric respects Japan's unique culture by ensuring Colega AI's operations are aligned with local values. For example, instead of focusing a Silicon Valley style approach, he prioritized building trust with local business owners and tailoring the AI agent to meet their specific needs. This strategy ensures the product resonates with the target audience while responding cultural nuance. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope our conversation will help your future and career. If you like this episode, please subscribe it and give your like. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。Ciao.